Good afternoon. So, for today, I'm going to discuss comprehension, specifically reading comprehension. So, I did some research and we're going to talk about my question and then we will go through some solutions that I found. So, my question for today is how can educators improve students' reading comprehension of expository and narrative texts? So, a little bit of background into why I chose this question and what really sparked my interest. So, first off, I teach 7th through 12th grade English. This year I'll be teaching 8th and 10th grade, but in the past I've taught 7th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade. So, I really have hit all the grades except for ninth. So, one thing that I noticed with teaching English is that a lot of my students really struggle with reading comprehension. So, if I give them a story and I say, I want you to read this story and I want you to come back and tell me what it's about, most of my students cannot do that. So, that's a big area of concern for me, especially because you need to be able to comprehend texts not only in English, but in science, in history, or just like out in the real world as well. So, I in particular was really focused on narrative text because I tend to teach a lot of narrative texts in my classroom. But I also wanted to add the expository texts because those tend to appear in social studies and in science. So, some of our core classes, and if our students don't know how to comprehend those texts, we can't expect them to succeed. So, I was really interested in comprehension of narrative and then expository texts as well. In addition, as I was doing my research, I found out that less than 1% of all classroom instruction time is spent teaching comprehension strategies. So, what we are doing as teachers is we are giving our students these texts and we're saying, read these and tell us what they're about, but we're not giving our students the skills that they need in order to comprehend them. So, we know that comprehension is a problem, but what are we going to do to fix it? As we go through this presentation, there are some definitions that we need to learn. So the first one would be comprehension. Comprehension is creating meaning with text. You are going to hear me talk about comprehension all presentation because that's our main topic. But essentially, we cannot expect a student to comprehend a text if we don't give them those skills. So we can't expect our students to have any meaning with a text if we're not preparing them with how to do that. In addition, we have narrative texts. So narrative texts, those are primarily what I teach in English, and those are essentially stories. So you can think of like Harry Potter, Wonder. Those are all some different books that are stories. In our stories, we typically see characters, setting, plot, theme, and those are all some characteristics that make up narrative texts. On the flip side, expository texts, those are more so informational texts. So I like to think of textbooks. And that's where I mentioned with like history and science, where a lot of students struggle with comprehending those. So those would be the expository texts that they don't often understand. We are going to start this presentation off with some expository comprehension strategies. And we will look at some different ways that we can support our students as they are trying to learn expository texts. So, the first thing that we can do is we can teach expository text structure. So a lot of students struggle with comprehending expository texts simply because they're unfamiliar with the expository text structure. So expository texts, they use a lot more formal language and they have different structures than a narrative text. So in a narrative text, we typically follow the same pattern of like a beginning, middle, and an end. But in expository, there are a bunch of different text structures which often lead to students being confused. So if we teach text structure, we can increase our students' comprehension. There are some different types of expository text structures that we see. So there's descriptive, sequence, causation, problem solution, and comparison. A lot of these are very similar to what they sound like. So a descriptive expository text structure, that's going to be a more informational text. So the text is going to provide details. A sequence expository text structure, that's where we see the events are in a chronological order. So that one goes like beginning. So if we're reading a history textbook, it might start in the 1800s and end in the 2000s. So that would be a sequence text. Causation, that describes an event and the effects. So it might describe the Great Depression and then all the effects that the Great Depression had. Problem solution, the text gives information about a problem and then provides solutions. So if we're talking about global warming, it might say that global warming is a problem and then provide some different solutions to avoid global warming. And then comparison, that's just similarities and differences. So comparison text might be comparing monkeys to gorillas. So those are some different types of expository text. You see in the examples that I gave where a lot of them tend to lead more towards science or social studies, which again is where we see them appear in our textbooks. In addition, for expository texts, one strategy is we could have the students list the critical ideas of the text. So this keeps the students focused because they are focusing on the important ideas that are covered in the text. So in expository text, we see a lot of times where there's different headings and there's subheadings, which really help guide our students as well to those critical ideas. There's also the core method, which is a different strategy that we can give students. So core method stands for connect, organize, reflect, and extend. For connect, that is where the student would connect the text to themselves. So there are some different text connections. So you can make a text to self connection, which is again what I said, where the student connects it to themselves. But we can also have students connect the text to some other text, or we can have them connect the text to the world. So there are 3 different options that they could do for the connection piece. So let's say that students are reading their science textbook and they're talking about cells. Well, students or humans are all made up of cells. So students could easily make a text to self connection that way. They could talk about animals because animals have cells. So that could be a text to a world connection. Or if they've read another text that talks about cells, they can make a text-to-text connection. Organize, that's where students can organize the information. So like I mentioned, in expository texts, a lot of the information is already given to you where it's broken down into subheadings. However, if it's like an article or something like that, the students might want to organize it based on the material that's talked about. Reflect, that's where students can reflect on strategies and structures. So we just talked about the different expository text structures. So students can go back and they can say, oh, okay, I think that this is a sequence text, or I think that this is a descriptive text. And then they can learn based on that. And then the extend is where students can extend the learning to new topics. So again, if the students are reading about cells, then maybe our extension is that the students have to build a model cell. I know when I was in science, that's something that we had to do, and it really helped us to learn, again, that cell model and the importance of cells. Another text structure would be an outline. So outlines, those provide the structure necessary to enable independent learning. Here is one example of an outline. I know it's a little bit difficult to see, but this one talks about an outline for an essay. So we know when we write an essay, we follow the certain outline. So there's an introduction, and then we have our body paragraphs, and then our conclusion. That's something that's been taught to us from a young age, but we can also give students outlines for different things. So if they're reading an article, maybe we want to give them an outline that discusses the main points of that article. Or if they're reading their textbook, okay, here's chapter 3's outline, and it discusses the main points. As students advance, they can start building their own outlines. So you can say, all right, I want you to read chapter 3 in your science textbook, and I want you to build an outline on the most important points that are brought up in that text. So we're starting our students with more of a guided learning, but then we're hopefully building them up to an independent learning. Another great strategy is guided notes. So guided notes, that's where students can insert notes as they are reading their text. Guided notes combine a lot of different strategies. So it can combine kind of an outline structure, which is what we just looked at. It can combine a concept map. There's a lot of different things that you can do with guided notes. I have one example here of a guided note. This one is just a fill in the blank, so the students go through and they're inserting the notes as they are reading. There's a couple different spots where they can add their own examples from prezzies or novels as well, but essentially they're filling in the blanks. Again, this is something that could guide the students to focus on certain elements as they are reading, But as they keep going and as they keep advancing through these strategies, they might be able to create their own note sheet without you having to prepare guided notes for them. So eventually you should be able to say, hey, I want you to go read chapter 6 and I want you to create a note sheet for me. And they should be able to do that based on the most important points and based on the practice with their guided notes. Another strategy is read and pause. So this is where students just read a paragraph and they pause to check for understanding. So you can do this as a class or you can have your students do it independently. So what they do is they'd read a paragraph, they'd be like, okay, did I understand what I just read? And if they did, they can keep reading. If not, they can go back and reread that paragraph. I know a lot of my students, when they're reading, they tend to zone out at certain points and then they are like, oh shoot, I have no idea what I just read. So by doing a pause and check for understanding, it helps students stay focused and it helps them make sure that they know what they're reading before they keep advancing and before the text gets more complicated. Similar to read and pause is dot and notes. So this is something that you can do so that you don't interrupt your reading flow. So dot and note, that's where students read a paragraph and then they put a dot next to important ideas and they finish reading the text. When they're all done reading a text, they go back and they look at those dotted ideas and then they take notes based on them. So like I mentioned, this is something that doesn't interrupt your reading flow, but it still makes note of the important ideas and it still makes sure that you're staying focused while you read the text. We also have the talking drawing strategy. This is one of my favorite ones simply because it can be used with any level of reader. So it can be used with the most beginner of reader or it can be used with the most advanced reader. But the talking drawing strategy, this creates a deeper meaning with the text because the students create a mental picture of what they think that the text is about. So if I have the book, The Three Little Pigs, I'm going to ask my students, what do you think that this text is about? And my students are going to create this mental image in their mind. Okay, well, Three Little Pigs, it must be about some sort of pig. And then they're going to draw their mental images. So I would hand out paper, I'd hand out drawing materials, and my students would draw what they just visualized. And then I'm going to break my students up into groups, and they're going to share their drawings to their peers. So they're going to say, okay, I drew 3 pigs because that's the title of the book, and then whatever else they might have drawn. Then we are going to read the text. Again, you can do this independently, or you can read the text to them. And as the text is being read, you're going to have your students stop, or you're going to stop, and you're going to ask them different comprehension questions along the way. So this will help the students realize, oh, my image was way off what I thought, or wow, I actually predicted pretty close to what the story is actually about. After reading the text, the students are going to go back and they can create a new drawing or they can modify their previous drawing. And then they're going to compare the beginning drawing to their end. So this is very, very similar to a KWL chart, but it has images. So instead of having the students just write down everything, you're going to have them draw things. And like I said, I really like this one because you can use it with any level of reader. And I know even like my 10th graders, when I do it with them, they think it's so fun because they don't get to draw that often in their classes. And so they really enjoy doing this one. For expository text, another great strategy is to teach vocabulary. This is so simple, but it's often something that's so overlooked. So students will struggle with comprehension if they don't know the words that they are reading. So if I'm a history teacher and I am teaching about the Holocaust, I have to give my students the most important vocabulary words so that they know when they read what each word means. There are also different vocabulary games that you can do. There's so many different ways to teach vocabulary, but if we want our students to comprehend, we have to give them that skill. So we have to teach them different vocabulary words so that they know what in the world they are reading about. I have students right now that are at like a 2nd grade reading level, and they're going into 9th grade right now. And a lot of times, their teachers will just give them texts, and they say, okay, read this. And my students don't know a lot of the different words in that text, so they shut down because they don't want to be the kids that are asking for help all the time. So we have to assume that our students have no idea what they are reading about and prepare them for those skills. So again, teaching vocabulary is a great way to do that. Kind of building on vocabulary is background knowledge. So Once we start building up our students' vocabulary, they will start gaining some different background knowledge as well. But text comprehension relies on background knowledge. Um, if, again, a student's reading about frogs, for example, a great thing to do is just be like, hey, what do you know about frogs? And just have the students jot down what they think that they know about frogs. So when they go through and they read, they can be like, oh, yeah, I actually feel like I did know a decent amount about frogs. Or, wow, I have no idea what frogs, or I have no idea what I'm reading about, or I don't know anything about frogs. So I really might need to focus on this text and figure out what the heck we're talking about. So, building background knowledge is so important. One great thing that we can do as teachers is we need to build our students' real world knowledge. So, if we teach them about the real world, they will strengthen their background knowledge as well, and they will become better readers. So, those are some great strategies to do for expository text. So we have background knowledge, teach vocabulary, talking drawing strategy, dot and notes, read and pause, guided notes, outlines, core method, and expository text structure. So those were a lot of different ideas, but those are some great ones that we can do for our students. In addition, we have strategies for narrative texts. So like I said, I wanted to focus on both expository and narrative because students aren't struggling with comprehension just in their English classes, it's beyond that. I primarily teach narrative texts, and I think that most English teachers probably do. So this one is great for if you are teaching narrative texts. So first, a strategy would be teach the story structure. This sounds so simple, but it's something that's often so overlooked. And what I mean by story structure is your beginning, middle, and end. So I know for like a lot of elementary kids, that's what they typically start off with is what happens in the beginning of the story, how about the middle of the story, and then the end. As you start advancing towards those upper level grades, we talk a lot about the plot mountain. So your exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Those are great things to teach to your students. And if they are a low level reader, you can break it down to beginning, middle, and end again for them. But ultimately, you want your students to be able to tell you after they read a story what happened in the beginning of the story, what happened in the middle of the story, and then how did the story end. So if we teach our students the story structure, they should be able to do that by the time they are done reading a narrative text. Another thing is to teach the elements of the story. Characters, setting, plot, theme. Those are all things that our students need to know if they want to be able to tell us about a narrative story. So, story elements, those are the pieces that make up a story. So we obviously have to teach our students those different elements. So characters, again, the people that are in the story. Setting, that's when and where the story takes place. The image up here has conflict, so the problems in the story. Resolution, how the story ends, so that's part of our plot. Key events, so basically the main ideas of the story. And then theme would be like the overall message of the story. So our students need to know those different things if they want to be able to comprehend a narrative text. And it also helps them bring the story to life. So a lot of students don't really like to read simply because they feel like it's boring. If we teach them these story elements and they feel like the story's coming to life, it often sparks their interest and it makes them more engaged in the story as well, which increases their comprehension. There are also some different things with narrative text. So again, you can do the read and pause. So same thing as an expository text, but you're doing it now in a narrative text. You read a paragraph, you pause and check for understanding, and then you can keep reading. A lot of students, they zone out with the narrative text because they think that they don't need to focus as much. So this is a great way to keep them engaged and to keep them focused on that text as well. Something that I love to do when I teach narrative text is I love to have my students make predictions. This makes them put their thinking caps on and it really makes them focus on the story. So something that I love doing is a predictograph. So that's when you give the students a question. So what do you think will happen to Johnny in the story? Or what do you think will happen to Victor right now? And before the students can make their prediction, they have to list 2 story clues and background knowledge that they think is important. So they cannot make their prediction until they have those clues and the background knowledge. So they can't just make some random prediction with no evidence, but they have to have those clues from the story before they can make their prediction. Semantic impressions, that's when you give students a list of keywords or phrases that represent the story, and then you ask them to review the list and then make a prediction based on what they think the story is about. So if I'm reading Harry Potter, I might have like wizard, wand, school, Hogwarts, and then I'm going to have them predict what they think that the story would be about. Stop and visualize. That's where you ask the students to stop throughout the story and visualize different images in their heads. So if I am reading to my students, I don't know, we'll say the Wednesday Wars, I might tell them, okay, stop right now. What do you see? And then they're just going to visualize in their heads. Or I might say, stop, what do you think hauling looks like right now? And then I'll have them visualize it. So this is a great way just to make sure that the students are staying engaged and to make sure that they are understanding what they are reading. Students can also use story mapping. So story mapping, that provides structure and organization for the students, and it's an active process. So that means that students are actively doing this when they are reading, and they are responsible for their learning. I have an example here of story mapping. So there's two different examples that I have. One is where there's different bubbles that the students have to go in and fill. So like title, events, setting, characters. And the students would have to go through and they would have to fill in those bubbles as they are reading. There's also the 5-point story map, which is probably for a little bit more of a beginner. Setting, resolution, conflict, problem, main characters, major events. Those are some different things, again, that students can go in and they can fill as they are reading. Once students kind of get more of the basic structures with story mapping, you can also make them more complex. So you can ask, is this character a major or a minor character? What is the biggest problem in this story? Make a plot mountain, and you can have them do those different things as they are story mapping. So those are some strategies for narrative texts. Some key takeaways with this presentation. So first, you must teach the process to develop the skill. So I had a college professor that would say this quite a bit. So what this means is that these are all just strategies. So these are some things that we want our students to be able to do, but we need to teach it in order to develop it. So we can't just give our students a text and say, read this text without any background knowledge or without any preparation and come back and tell me what it's about. So we must teach them these different strategies that this presentation was all about in order for them to be able to comprehend a text. However, each of these things, these are skills. So we want our students to eventually be able to do these things on their own. So we shouldn't always have to be like, okay, I'm going to stop right now and ask you to draw a picture of what you see. We shouldn't always have to do that because eventually we want our students to be able to do those things on their own. We shouldn't always have to give them guided notes. Eventually they should be able to start making their own. So we want to build up those skills, but we also want our students to become independent learners and do some of those things on their own. Number 2, modeled teaching is crucial for each of these strategies. Again, I can't give a student a text and expect them to read it cold. I have to teach them how to comprehend. I can't just say, okay, I want you to do guided notes and not give them any instruction besides that. If I expect my students to do guided notes, I have to be up there and I have to give them a specific example of what's expected of them before they can actually do it. So students need us to be teaching them how to do these different strategies, and they need us to show them these strategies so that they can comprehend texts. Once we start piecing these things together, we'll see our students have increased reading levels and we'll see them comprehend their text, not just in English, but in social studies, in history, and all around they're going to be better, well-rounded students. Thank you.